How much better is a $3,000 to $4,000 purpose-built home theater projector than a $1,000 to $2,000 lifestyle projector? Let's find out. In the first test, we'll see which projector has the brightest picture and the best contrast. Then we'll see which projector comes from the factory with the most accurate colors and which is best after a professional calibration. Then we'll test their sharpness and focus uniformity. After that, we'll evaluate viewing experience using HDR, SDR, 24p, and 60 frames per second content. For gamers, we'll test input lag. And last, we'll look at the features that allow for flexible projector placement like optical zoom, lens shift, and digital keystoning. For a price of $2,799, the least expensive home theater projector that we're going to be testing today is the Optoma UHZ50, which has a single color laser light source, meaning you won't need to worry about replacing bulbs that lose brightness or change color as they age. The UHZ50 has a single 0.47-inch DLP chip that uses 4 times pixel shifting to achieve a true 8 million pixel 4K resolution. The UHZ50 is reasonably sized for a home theater projector at 15 by 10.5 by 4 inches, and it has 3 HDMI inputs, 1 specialized for ultra low latency gaming, 1 standard HDCP 2.2 input, and 1 that allows for pure motion MEMC to smooth out motion blur. The UHZ50 is made in China. The 2 most important features of a home theater projector are brightness and contrast. So in the first test, I used the ANSI lumen standard to measure their brightest setting by taking a reading at 9 separate points on an all-white screen, averaging those measurements, and then multiplying by the screen size in square meters. I also calculated the total color brightness on that same brightest picture mode by substituting the all-white screen for a red screen, green screen, and blue screen, and then adding those 3 values together. In this test, the Optoma UHZ50 had 2,332 white ANSI lumens, which is 22% less than its advertised 3,000 ANSI lumens, and it only had 1,634 lumens of combined color brightness. The UHZ50 also had a less than impressive 67% brightness uniformity, which is calculated by dividing the measurement from the dimmest area of the screen by the brightest one. When comparing the brightness of the all-white screen to the brightness of an all-black screen, the UHZ50 had an insane full-on, full-off contrast ratio of 17,672 to 1, but that number is extremely misleading, not only because the brightest picture mode usually has poor color accuracy, but also because projectors often dynamically increase the power to their light source when an all-white screen is detected and dim or turn off their light source completely when an all-black screen is shown. To combat this behavior, I also tested what I call the functional brightness and contrast of each projector after color calibrating them using professional equipment by Portrait Studios and Calman Ultimate 2023 software. During these tests, I also used a special test pattern that uses a 50% gray box traveling around the outside of the screen that prevents the dynamic boosting and dimming of the light source that leads to these unrealistic measurements. In my post-calibration test using a 100-inch 1.0 gain white screen, the UHZ50 had a functional peak brightness of 169.9 nits, which is roughly equivalent to around 1,470 ANSI lumens. And when testing an all-black screen with the 50% gray square, the UHZ50 had a black floor of 0.23 nits for a functional sequential contrast ratio of 718 to 1. When projecting the all-white screen, the Optoma UHZ50 drew 196 watts, and I measured the fan noise at 41 decibels from 12 inches away. Next, for a price of $2,999, is the newly released BENQ HT4550i, which uses BENQ's 4 LED light engine, which, like a laser light source, should provide roughly 20,000 hours of viewing at normal brightness before any significant degradation in brightness or color of the light source. The HT4550i is using a new larger 0.65-inch DLP chip, but it still relies on 4 times pixel shifting to generate a true 8 million pixel 4K image. The HT4550i is slightly larger than the UHZ50 at 16.5 by 11.5 by 5 inches. The HT4550i has 2 HDMI inputs as well as a third HDMI input that's reserved for the built-in Android 11 streaming dongle that does support Netflix. The BENQ is made in China. In my standard ANSI lumen test, the HT4550i had a maximum of 2,848 ANSI lumens, which is 89% of its claimed 3,200 lumens and over 500 more than the Optoma, with a brightness uniformity of 90%. But the BENQ had a combined color brightness of just 1,798 lumens. In my post-calibration testing, the BENQ had a peak white brightness of 183.9 nits, or around 1,590 lumens, and a black floor of 0.161 nits, giving it a functional sequential contrast ratio of 1,142 to 1 in normal brightness mode. When projecting an all-white screen, the HT4550i drew 218 watts and had a fan noise of 42 decibels, measured from 12 inches. After that, also for $2,999, is a projector that has become the gold standard in home theater projectors, the Epson 5050UB. Unlike the previous two projectors, the Epson 5050UB uses an ultra-high efficiency bulb instead of lasers or LEDs, which means the brightness and color accuracy will degrade faster with use, and most home theater experts recommend changing the bulb on the 5050UB after every 3,000 hours of usage, meaning you're going to need to change the bulb roughly 6 times on the 5050UB before a laser or LED projector's light source will be significantly degraded. Also, unlike the previous projectors which use DLP technology, the Epson uses a 3 LCD system where red, green, and blue light are each cast through a different LCD display before being recombined into a single image that gets projected. One major advantage of 3 LCD systems over DLP is that because each color is being projected simultaneously, it won't suffer from the DLP Rainbow Effect, which different people have varying levels of sensitivity to, and we'll test that later on in the video. Epson advertises the 5050UB as having 4K Pro UHD technology, which is pretty misleading because it doesn't actually have 4K resolution at all. Instead, Epson uses a 2x pixel shifting to make an image that has 4 million pixels, which is just half of 4K. So we'll have to see how that affects its clarity test later on. Compared to the Optoma and BENQ, the Epson 5050UB is absolutely massive at 20.5 by 18 by 6 inches. And for connectivity, the 5050UB has 2 standard HDMI ports supporting HDCP 2.2, but no ARC or eARC, and it also has a 15-pin D-sub VGA connector for an older computer. The Epson 5050UB is made in China. In my brightness testing, the 5050UB had a surprisingly high 3033 ANSI lumens on its brightest setting, which is not only 200 lumens brighter than the BENQ, but also 400 lumens or 16% brighter than its advertised 2600 lumens. And as expected with Epson's 3 LCD projection system, the 5050UB also had a very similar combined color brightness at 3095 lumens. And in both white and color modes, its brightness uniformity was approximately 87%. Post-calibration numbers weren't nearly as impressive, with just 159.9 nits peak brightness, or roughly 1383 lumens. But a very impressive black floor of 0.047 nits, which is over 3 times darker than the BENQ and 5 times darker than the Optoma, giving the 5050UB an impressive contrast ratio of 3,371 to 1, and justifying that UB or ultra black distinction. While showing the full white screen, the 5050UB drew a massive 329 watts and had by far the loudest fan yet, measuring 48 decibels from 12 inches away. And the most expensive home theater projector we'll be testing today is the $3,999 Epson LS11000. The LS11000 has a lot in common with the 5050UB, but trades the UHE bulb for a single color laser light source. And while it still uses Epson's 3 LCD projection system, this time it has 4 times pixel shifting to deliver a true 8 million pixel 4K resolution. The LS11000 is nearly identical to the 5050UB and also measures in at 20.5 by 18 by 6 inches and has similar connectivity with 2 HDMI ports, this time with both ARC and eARC, but it loses that 15-pin VGA port. The Epson LS11000 is made in the Philippines. In my brightness test, the Epson LS11000 had 2,366 ANSI lumens, which is 95% of its advertised 2,500 lumens, and it had a brightness uniformity of 80%. Epson's 3 LCD technology is known for its excellent color brightness, and the LS11000 was no exception, with 2,386 lumens of combined color brightness. But even though the LS11000 was far less impressive than the 5050UB in the raw brightness tests, the post-calibration functional brightness was significantly better. I measured the functional peak brightness of the LS11000 at an impressive 194.3 nits, which is around 1680 lumens. And the LS11000 also had the most impressive black floor of 0.038 nits, giving it an effective sequential contrast ratio of 5,115 to 1, which puts it in first place by a pretty significant margin. When projecting an all-white screen, the Epson LS11000 drew 233 watts and had a fan noise of 45 decibels when measured from 12 inches. So the home theater projector with the most effective brightness after calibration was the Epson LS11000, followed by the BENQ HT4550i, then the Optoma UHZ50, and last was the Epson 5050UB. The effective contrast ratio was dominated by the 3 LCD projectors from Epson due to their much lower black floor, with the LS11000 in first, followed by the 5050UB, and then significantly lower we've got the BENQ HT4550i and the Optoma UHZ50. I also tested the BENQ in Smart Eco mode, which drastically increases the contrast to 1809:1, but I found the light source modulation to be distracting and noticeable, so I wouldn't personally choose to use it. It's no surprise that all these home theater focused projectors are very good, but the original question was, how much better are they than the much less expensive options that I've tested on my channel? And to answer that, I ran the exact same test using the $2,200 JMGO N1 Ultra and the $1,300 Dangbei Mars Pro. Just like the other projectors, all the tests were done after calibration to a delta E under 3.0, which is generally regarded as the point where the human eye can no longer tell the difference between two shades of the same color. The Dangbei Mars Pro had a post-calibration peak brightness of 152.8 nits, or approximately 1320 lumens, and a black floor of 0.216 nits for an effective sequential contrast ratio of 709:1. The JMGO N1 Ultra's post-calibration peak brightness was 166.7 nits, or 1440 lumens, with a black floor of 0.127 nits for an effective sequential contrast ratio of 1316:1. That means that for effective peak brightness, all of the purpose-built home theater projectors stayed on top, but an effective sequential contrast ratio, the JMGO N1 Ultra sneaks into third place in front of the BENQ HT4550i, and the $1,300 Dangbei Mars Pro falls just behind the $2,800 Optoma UHZ50. In addition to contrast, another thing that sets home theater projectors apart from what you'd see in a classroom or a conference room is their ability to accurately portray colors, not only in the SDR Rec 709 color space, but also in the HDR DCI-B3 color space and the future-proof BT 2020 color space. To determine their color performance, I used a Portrait C6 HDR 2000 professional colorimeter, a Portrait VideoForge 8K signal generator, and Calman Ultimate 2023 software to measure their actual color gamut coverage as well as their accuracy, or delta E, of their most accurate preset. And then after that, I calibrated each projector for my specific screen and viewing space. For the Rec 709 color space, which is what SDR content is mastered in, all the projectors had roughly 100% coverage except for the Dangbei Mars Pro, which had 93.5%. Stepping up to the next largest color space, DCI-P3, which is the standard for HDR content, the JMGO N1 Ultra's triple laser light source dominated with 99.9% coverage, followed closely by the BENQ HT4550i with its wide color gamut filter engaged. And then after that was the Epson 5050UB in digital cinema mode. The only projector that could come close to covering the largest BT 2020 color space was the JMGO N1 Ultra with 99% coverage, but the rest of the projectors struggled to break 75%. I also measured the color accuracy out of the box using built-in presets, and I found that the BENQ HT4550i was extremely accurate with a factory delta E of just 1.3, which is almost unheard of. The Epson LS11000 also performed very well out of the box with a factory calibrated delta E of 2.4, while the rest of the projectors had large enough errors out of the box that they would benefit from a professional calibration. But when calibrating, not all projectors have the correct menus and options to perfect their color accuracy. However, all the projectors in this video have the ability to do at least some color tuning, and I found that the BENQ HT4550i had by far the best options for tweaking color that were not only responsive but also behaved exactly like you would expect, allowing me to calibrate it to a grayscale and color delta E of less than 1, which is what you would expect from a professional studio monitor. The Epson projectors were a little more difficult to calibrate and lacked some of the granular control of the HT4550i, while the Optoma UHZ50 had the worst controls and lacked any multi-point grayscale calculation, resulting in the highest grayscale average delta E of 4.2. The JMGO N1 Ultra and Dangbei Mars Pro both use Android's built-in calibration features, which I thought were only included in Android 11, but are accessible in the Dangbei Mars Pro using a hidden menu accessed by pressing the left remote button 4 times from the top of the screen. Combining scores for color space coverage, factory presets, and calibration options, the BENQ HT4550i is by far the most color accurate. Then the JMGO N1 Ultra, followed by the Epson LS11000, the Epson 5050UB, the Dangbei Mars Pro, and last was the Optoma UHZ50. After brightness, contrast, and color, the next important aspect of a high-end projector is sharpness and focus. To test this, I projected a 4K image with a white background and black text with 16-point font, and I took close-up pictures of the center of the screen and each corner, and then I repeated that test with white text on a black background. Starting with the sharpness test, pause the video for a few seconds here and figure out which zoomed-in image looks the best to you. For me, each one has some pros and cons, starting with the upper left. The image from the Epson 5050UB had a very defined diagonal pixel structure due to its 2x pixel shift. RGB alignment was very good with no chromatic aberration and very little striping. Underneath that is the Epson LS11000, which has more of a crosshatch pattern due to its extra pixel shifts, and it appears to be much sharper around the edges of the letters. Next is the Dangbei Mars Pro, which I think has the sharpest focus, but some very noticeable green and yellow chromatic aberration around the outside of the text, and a noticeable screen door effect in between the pixels. Above that is the BENQ HT4550i, which could have been great. Not only do the high quality optics give it great focus and zero chromatic aberration, but the larger 0.65-inch DLP chip means that each individual mirror on the chip is larger relative to the space in between them, resulting in significantly reduced screen door effect. However, the sharpening algorithm of the BENQ introduced double thickness lines in the lowercase a's and n's, and even lost some pixels in the h. On the top right, the Optoma UHZ50 not only lacked focus in general, but also had pretty bad chromatic aberration and horizontal screen door effect. And then on the bottom right, the JMGO N1 Ultra had an extremely pronounced screen door effect and some red chromatic aberration around the edges of each letter. With the white text on the black background, the BENQ HT4550i absolutely stood out to me as the best image, with clear text, zero chromatic aberration, and very little screen door effect. The Epson projectors were nice and clear, but with noticeable pixelation and some color misalignment on the LS11000. The rest of the DLP projectors had significant chromatic aberration, with the JMGO N1 Ultra performing by far the worst, with huge red shadows behind each letter. To measure focus uniformity, I compared the text from each of the four corners of a screen projected with zero keystoning. In this test, the Optoma UHZ50 performed the worst, with soft focus on the lower right corner and double imaging in the lower left corner. After that, the Dangbei Mars Pro had some focus issues in the bottom left corner, and the BENQ HT4550i was just a little soft in every single one of the corners. The Epson LS11000, JMGO N1 Ultra, and Epson 5050UB were absolutely laser focused and crisp in every corner, and I wasn't able to pick a standout winner between those three. So assuming that all the projectors are properly color calibrated, the projector with the best combination of brightness, contrast, sharpness, and focus should have the best picture quality in theory. But in practice, things like motion handling and HDR tone mapping can have a big impact on overall viewing experience. So starting with the absolute easiest content to make good, bright 4K SDR content filmed in 60 frames per second, we're going to use the opening scene from Gemini Man. And honestly, every single one of these projectors made this scene look incredible. And in a blind real-time test, I don't think I would be able to identify any major differences from one projector to another. But I did pull out a still to nitpick just a little bit. Pay close attention to the ability for the projector to show shiny skin without looking waxy, the sharpness of each of Will Smith's whiskers, and the pores on his nose. For me, the BENQ HT4550i was a little better than the rest, with perfect color accuracy, sharpness, and detail. But as I said, without a single freeze frame, there isn't much difference in the scene. So let's move on to something a little bit more difficult, a dark scene in HDR. Without going into too much technical detail, the problem with watching HDR content over SDR is that SDR content is mastered with a target peak brightness of 100 nits, and all the projectors in this video can easily hit that target brightness. However, HDR content is mastered for a peak brightness between 1000 and 10,000 nits, depending on the studio and the content, meaning the LS11000 with the highest effective brightness of 194.3 nits after calibration can only produce about 20% of the required brightness to correctly display even the most conservative HDR content. The way that projector companies account for this is called HDR tone mapping, and it basically squeezes that high dynamic range content into a much lower dynamic range that the projector can actually achieve. And in practice, tone mapping differences between brands were very significant. For this test, I picked Season 1, Episode 4 of Obi-Wan, which has some extremely dark scenes, specifically the interrogation room scene. On each projector, I played the scene 2 times, once in HDR10 mode, and then again after disabling HDR at the source. As expected, the HDR mode was always darker than the SDR mode, but the Optoma UHZ50 had the most aggressive tone mapping and produced by far the most watchable HDR image, while the wide color gamut filter that engages on the BENQ HT4550i during HDR content made the scene too dim to watch. However, at this level of projector, a lot of image quality is going to come down to personal preference, and to my eye, the best version of the scene came from the BENQ HT4550i in SDR mode, which maintained most of the color and saturation of the LS11000 and UHZ50's HDR image, but had enough contrast in the shadows to not lose detail. Adding in the more budget-friendly projectors for comparison, the JMGO N1 Ultra had extremely aggressive tone mapping and made the HDR image look more like the SDR images from the other projectors. While on the Dangbei Mars Pro, my preference would be to turn HDR off at the source. Another thing to note is that the Epson LS11000 and 5050UB had significantly lower black floors than the rest of the projectors. And as a result, when watching on the UHZ50, there was no difference in the black level of the darkest portion of the scene and the widescreen top and bottom black bars. While on the Epson projectors, the black bars were noticeably darker than the darkest blacks in the scene. But I personally don't think that the black levels were unacceptable on any of the projectors. Another thing to note is that the Epson projectors can adjust tone mapping to be more or less aggressive, and my personal preference would be to turn it down to closer to 4 or 5, but the default setting is 8. Moral of the story here for image quality, no matter which projector in this price bracket you choose, there's a very good chance that you're going to be able to tweak the settings to get the image very close to perfect. And I can't pick the perfect projector for you because your preferences and what you define as perfect are likely different than what I do. But I can almost guarantee that if you invite someone over to your house to watch a movie, or you show the image to your kid or significant other, they're going to think that it's awesome and won't notice any of the things that you nitpick about. However, there are a few things that I think even non-home theater snobs can notice and be bothered by. The first one's being 24p Judder and its evil cousin, the frame interpolation soap opera effect. Basically, most movies and shows are filmed in 24 frames per second, but the DLP and LCD chips in these projectors usually refresh at 60 Hz, which doesn't divide evenly by 24. The fix is to do some kind of motion interpolation that estimates a middle frame based on the previous and next frame. However, too much motion interpolation can cause the soap opera effect that takes footage that was supposed to look cinematic and it makes it look hyper-realistic. The ideal solution is to turn on motion interpolation to a low enough setting that it removes judder without introducing any soap opera effect. I used the opening scene from Ted Lasso's Season 3, Episode 8, which has some of the most brutal smooth panning judder I've ever seen. And here's a chart of the judder and soap opera effect of the motion smoothing options on each projector. As you can see, every projector had a sweet spot where the judder was gone and the soap opera effect was extremely minimal. And again, this is specifically to my eye, but you'll likely be able to tune the settings for your own preference on whichever projector you choose. A couple interesting things to note, the BENQ HT4550i has a special mode called 24p True Cinema that changed the refresh rate of the screen significantly to the point where it was no longer being properly filmed by my Sony a7 IV camera recording at 1/60th exposure time. But for me, it didn't seem to solve any of the judder issues and actually made them worse. The same was true for the Optoma UHZ50, which noticeably changed its refresh rate when 24p content was played, instead of just trying to display 24p content at 60 Hz. But again, the judder was still very noticeable. Another strange thing about the Optoma is that motion interpolation, which Optoma calls pure motion, is only available on HDMI 3, and the fast gaming features are only available on HDMI 1, while on other projectors those features are selectable on each input by changing image processing from fast to fine. The next thing that may bother even a novice home theater snob is called the DLP Rainbow Effect, or RBE. Sensitivity to RBE is something that varies from person to person, but I'm lucky enough to have to force myself to see it, so it doesn't bother me in most cases. However, I designed an RBE torture test to be able to evaluate the severity of RBE on each specific projector. In this lineup, the only projector that showed any noticeable RBE on camera was the Dangbei Mars Pro, and it was also the easiest to see in person. I could also see a very small amount of RBE on the Optoma UHZ50 under normal conditions, and the only way that I could make myself see RBE on the JMGO N1 Ultra and BENQ HT4550i was to blink my eyes rapidly and shake my head, so I wouldn't recommend doing that during a movie. As expected, based on their 3 LCD technology, neither the LS11000 nor the 5050UB showed any RBE at all. And the last thing that may bother even a layperson is laser speckle, which is really only an issue on a triple laser light source. In this video, only the lower priced JMGO N1 Ultra suffers from laser speckle. And like RBE, everyone has a different sensitivity to it, but it should be taken into consideration when making your final decision. The next thing to consider is that all the stuff we just talked about, like motion interpolation and tone mapping, is done by an image processor inside of the projector. But applying that extra processing adds time in between when the video source comes into the projector and when it gets displayed on the screen. This is referred to as input lag, and when playing competitive, fast-paced video games where reaction time is the most important thing, delay caused by your projector is unacceptable. To test input lag, I use the industry standard Leo Bodner lag tester that flashes a white box on the screen at different resolutions and refresh rates, and then measures how long it took that white flash to be projected using a photodiode. I measure the input lag at 4K 60 Hz, where the Optoma UHZ50, BENQ HT4550i, Epson LS11000, and Epson 5050UB had input lag times very close to or below the 20 millisecond mark that's generally the cutoff for highly competitive gaming. while the JMGO N1 Ultra was at 35.1 milliseconds and the Dangbei Mars Pro was at 40.5 milliseconds, which is still totally fine for casual gaming, but not for competitive first-person shooters. To get that extra edge, gaming at a higher refresh rate like 1080p 120Hz can give a competitive advantage as long as it doesn't add to input lag, but only the Optoma UHZ50 improved its input lag by moving to 120Hz, while the JMGO N1 Ultra and Dangbei Mars Pro went over the 50 millisecond mark that's generally acceptable, and the Epson 5050UB couldn't display 1080p 120Hz at all. And last, to wrap up this very long video, let's talk about the biggest thing that separates a home theater projector apart from a lifestyle projector like the Dangbei Mars Pro or JMGO N1 Ultra: high quality optics. Starting with the most advanced optics, the Epson LS11000 and Epson 5050UB have motorized focus, zoom, and lens shift, giving you a huge amount of flexibility when it comes to mounting location. Unlike mounting a projector to the side and aiming it diagonally, lens shift doesn't cause distortion that needs to be fixed with keystone, and so it doesn't cause focus uniformity issues. Likewise, optical zoom allows you to significantly adjust the screen size and throw distance without losing any resolution like you would if you used digital zoom and digital keystoning like on lifestyle projectors. The BENQ HT4550i also has a generous horizontal and vertical lens shift as well as optical zoom, but it trades motorization for a more economical and compact manual system with dials on the top of the projector. The Optoma UHZ50 has optical zoom and a small amount of vertical lens shift, but only enough to provide you with a little bit of wiggle room in case you mount the projector in a slightly different spot than you planned. To me, the UHZ50's optical system seemed a little too limited to be useful, while Epson's implementation was clearly the best, but is almost required since the projectors themselves are so massive. And the BENQ HT4550i's implementation provides a very useful amount of flexibility without adding too much size or weight to the projector. Alright, so conclusion time. If I had to pick the best projector in this video, all things considered, it would be the Epson LS11000, with high brightness and contrast, good color accuracy, adjustable tone mapping, decent input lag, and most importantly, a great motorized optics system. And I think you would be hard-pressed to find a person who would take an issue with the image produced by the LS11000. However, I think the BENQ HT4550i is 95% as good as the LS11000, but for $1,000 less. The HT4550i had the best pre- and post-calibration color accuracy, the second highest effective brightness, my favorite image when displaying both SDR and HDR content, extremely low input lag, and a very flexible optical system with optical zoom, vertical, and horizontal lens shift. And it's got the added benefit of a Netflix-compatible Android 11 built-in streaming dongle. So it's an easy decision, right? Well, the HT4550i is 95% as good as the LS11000, but the Dangbei Mars Pro is 95% as good as the HT4550i for just $1,300. Sure, the Dangbei doesn't have 100% Rec 709 color space coverage, and it had the second worst black floor at 0.216 nits, but assuming you can deal with the extra input lag and mount the Mars Pro to fill your screen without keystoning, I don't think that there is a single person who would tell you that the image from the HT4550i or LS11000 was twice as good as the Mars Pro. And take it with a grain of salt because she's 10, but when I asked my daughter which image she preferred, she chose the Mars Pro 4 out of 5 times. If you're a 3D movie guy, unfortunately Epson dropped support for 3D on the LS11000, but you'll be happy to know that the HT4550i does an amazing job with all 3D formats, and so does the JMGO N1 Ultra. The Dangbei Mars Pro will play side by side in top and bottom 3D formats, but not frame packing from 3D Blu-rays. And the Optoma UHZ50 is the opposite and can display 3D from a 3D source, but I couldn't force it into 3D mode when playing side by side or top and bottom 3D content. I'm pretty sure I covered everything you might want to know about these high-end home theater projectors, but if I forgot something, feel free to ask me down in the comments. If you want to know more about the Dangbei Mars Pro or JMGO N1 Ultra, check out my other video on lifestyle projectors, and I've got links down in the description to buy all the projectors from this video, and as always, I'd appreciate if you use those links since as an Amazon affiliate, I do earn a small commission on the sale at no cost to you. Thank you so much to all of my awesome patrons over at Patreon for your continued support of my channel, and if you're interested in supporting the channel, please check out the links down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching The Hookup.